So, it's Halloween, that time of the year when we celebrate all things spooky. Starting last year, I have a tradition where for the month of October I replay the first 4 Silent Hill games as a way of celebrating the season. And I still greatly enjoy all 4. Silent Hill 2 is definitely the best one, but I also really like Silent Hill 1 and 3. And while it's clearly the black sheep of the bunch, I've grown a bit of a soft spot for Silent Hill 4, as its sheer uniqueness makes up for its flaws. Mostly. Although I would recommend that anyone curious about Silent Hill 4 play it on the easiest difficulty setting, because mechanically Silent Hill 4 is a bit of a mess. And as a result, easy mode is the only mode I would say is truly fair to the player. Speaking of difficulty settings, this year I gave up on Silent Hill 2 when I was partway through the game because I made the mistake of playing it on hard mode. I figured I was familiar enough with the game that I could handle a little extra challenge, and for a while that was true. However, everything came to a screeching halt when I reached the bit in the hospital when James and Maria have to run away from Pyramid Head. Because unlike in normal mode, Maria dies almost instantly to Pyramid Head's attacks, and she runs so slowly that there's not much you can do. And every time she dies, you get a game over, which is unequivocally bullshit because Maria dies at the end of that section anyway. I could not for the life of me get past this bit, and I really didn't want to restart the entire game again from the beginning on normal mode just to make it past this bit, so I figured, fuck it, I'll just try again next October, and moved on to Silent Hill 3. So that's one piece of advice I'd like to impart. If you haven't played Silent Hill 2 yet, go ahead and play it by any means necessary, right now, because it deserves to be played. But if you do play it, don't play it on hard mode unless you're a masochist, because that one bit is a nightmare to try to get past. Anyways, rant over. While I'm continuing my journey through gaming's history and playing through old classics that are new to me, this year I've also been playing a lot of indie horror games in an attempt to find something just as good as Silent Hill, and I have managed to find a few gems. Tormented Souls is a survival horror game that very clearly wears its Resident Evil and Silent Hill influence on its sleeve, while still providing its own spin on the genre. It's definitely not perfect, and it is a bit rough around the edges, but it does a lot right, and I greatly enjoyed it. Iron Lung is a simple yet extremely compelling horror game that captures the fear of being trapped in a fragile tiny space surrounded by danger on every side. I wouldn't say it's the scariest game ever made like some people have, as I think that's overselling it a bit, and fear is subjective, but I also really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, I've also come across a lot of indie horror games that were either mediocre or just straight up garbage. Many of them clearly meant well, but just weren't very good. So today I'd like to use the original 4 Silent Hill games as a reference point, and use them to discuss 6 lessons that indie horror games really need to learn. Lesson 1, give us context. One of the things that made the old Silent Hill games work was that they grounded us in an environment that felt real. In Silent Hill 1 you play as Harry Mason, a man on a road trip with his daughter when his car crashes in Silent Hill, and his daughter goes missing. He then tries to search for her in the town, only to find it eerily empty. In Silent Hill 2, you play as James Sunderland, and he goes to Silent Hill to try to look for his deceased wife because he's seemingly got a letter from her, and finds the town eerily empty. And so on. All of the games make it clear who you are and where you are, so that way when things descend into madness as the game goes on, it carries actual weight and significance. Too many indie horror games will just toss you into creepy environments with no context or explanation at all. If we don't know who we are, where we are, or have any understanding of what is going on, we're only going to feel confusion, not fear. You have to establish some rules if you want to break them, and scary monsters and environments are more effective when they're contrasted with more normal places and things. My favorite part of Silent Hill 1 is the school, and what makes it so effective is that it looks like an actual school, which makes the ambient noises and monsters all the more unnerving, because they clearly don't belong and convey that something is horribly wrong. And when you transfer over to the Nightmare School, it's incredibly creepy because it changes the rules of how things work, and represents a further step into the darkness that's haunting the town. All of this works because the game provides context that builds up to something scary, rather than just tossing the player right into the scary stuff without warning or explanation. It's something that more indie horror games need to understand. A good example of what not to do in this regard is Scorn. I contributed to this game's Kickstarter back in 2017, and I was curious to see how the game had turned out. In short, I was disappointed. While the environment design and overall atmosphere was great, what killed it for me was the complete lack of context. You're given absolutely no idea of who you are, where you are, or what you're trying to accomplish. And this made it impossible for me to get invested and care enough to keep going. I understand that they wanted to keep things vague, but there's a fine line between leaving enough mystery to let your imagination fill in the gaps and just not explaining anything. You don't need to take a ton of time to establish context, just enough so that the player can ground themselves in the game's world. Because if you don't, you're going to lose the player due to confusion or boredom. Lesson 2, find a balance between quiet moments and intense moments. In order to make a good horror game, or even just a good game, you have to have good pacing, and that requires alternating the tone and mood of the game. If you just keep doing the same thing with no variation, it's going to become boring no matter what it is. It is important to have slower moments to build up tension, but you can't have them go on for too long, nor should you have literally nothing happening, because that's just going to bore the player. And it is important to have more intense moments that scare or surprise the player, but if you keep the intense moments coming one after another with no break, it's just going to overwhelm the player and eventually just end up being white noise. The slower moments are critical to proper pacing and building of tension, and while some horror games overdo the slower moments, I found it more common for horror games to not do them enough. And sometimes it's not even strictly about how often monsters pop up. I love Tormented Souls, and it paces itself reasonably well, but one thing it doesn't do that the Silent Hill games did do was having occasional moments of eerie silence. In Tormented Souls, there's always music playing, and while the soundtrack is good, there were some moments that would have been better if there had been no sounds other than the protagonist's footsteps and ambient noises. This also comes into play during some of the nightmare sequences where you travel to an otherworld version of the mansion for a bit that is very reminiscent of the otherworlds of Silent Hill. Now, aesthetically speaking, these areas are great, but the problem is that the music is a little too loud and intense, as if it's trying to hammer home that this is scary. But honestly, it ended up diminishing the effect rather than enhancing it. I think these parts would have been much creepier and more effective if there had just been silence, or at least more subdued music. Another good example of a horror game done wrong is Doom 3. For me, the biggest problem with the game is that whenever you ask yourself, is there going to be a monster in the next room, 90% of the time the answer is yes, which removes most of the tension and ambiguity, and the endless barrage of creatures to fight ends up feeling exhausting and tedious. The only times the game actually felt scary to me were ironically the few times where monsters weren't around, because it made me uneasy wondering where they were, and if they'd cut out 30 to 50% of the monsters from the game, they could have maintained this feeling throughout the whole game. So basically, pacing is critical. Don't overdo the quiet moments, but don't overdo the loud moments either. Lesson 3. Not being able to defend yourself is not necessarily scary, and vice versa. Now, some games can make it work. Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a great example of how to do a horror game where you can't defend yourself, and it still remains an excellent horror game to this day. But being able to defend yourself is not necessarily a bad thing, and if done right, it can actually raise the tension. In Silent Hill 3, Heather can defend herself, but the amount of ammo and healing items she can find is limited, and some of the enemies are pretty dangerous. This forces the player to make tough decisions regarding how they play. Should I fight the enemies, or should I just run away? The player can still defend themselves if necessary, but fighting is never easy or painless, and so the game is still scary. Not being able to defend yourself is harder to pull off, and can easily backfire if done wrong. Since you have no means of defense, all you can do is run away from enemies, and typically if an enemy catches you, it's instantly a game over. If this is done too much, the game stops being scary and just becomes annoying. Amnesia pulled it off by spacing out the monster encounters, as it understood that if it overused them, they would lose their sting. But too many horror games have no understanding of pacing, and will overuse their monsters to the point where the player reacts with apathy rather than fear. Like I said before, balance is everything. Overall, I think it's better to let the player be able to defend themselves, as removing combat altogether has a higher risk of making the game annoying, boring, or both. But having no combat can work, it just takes greater care and planning, something that many indie horror games sadly lack. Lesson 4. Don't rely on jump scares. By far the worst type of jump scare is when the monster catches you and then screams loudly in your face before killing you. This is extremely irritating, and far too many games do it. Do not do this, because if your game screeches loudly in my ear, I'm going to stop playing it and request a refund, and I would strongly recommend everybody else do the same. Now, jump scares are not inherently bad, and contrary to what some people claim, the Silent Hill games do have a few. But they don't rely on them, and when they do happen, they aren't over the top. In Silent Hill 1, there's a bit where a corpse falls out of a locker. It's a little startling, but it doesn't overdo it, and it adds to the unnerving atmosphere rather than distracting from it. Jump scares work when they are used sparingly, and often when they actually have teeth. A good example is if an enemy unexpectedly appears and you then have to fight it off. It's a surprise, so it startles you, but it's an actual threat, so it remains scary even after you calm down. Unfortunately, too many jump scares have no ambition or purpose beyond just making the player jump, which isn't hard to do considering that humans have certain instinctual and involuntary reactions to sudden unexpected noises and visuals. When done right, an occasional jump scare can add to the fear a horror game is supposed to invoke in a player. But if it's done wrong or too much, a jump scare just becomes a cheap tactic that does get the player to jump, but it doesn't actually scare, it only startles. Good horror games don't rely on jump scares, and if your game is relying heavily on jump scares, that's bad and you should stop it. Lesson 5. At least try to have good writing. Now, a horror game doesn't necessarily need to have a well-written story. Frankly, the story in Silent Hill 1 and 3 is incredibly stupid and doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, it's bizarre enough that it does add to the overall sense of being trapped in a nightmare that the games are going for, so it ends up working in their favor. But generally speaking, it's better to have a story that's actually well written, which is what makes Silent Hill 2 and 4 so good. Silent Hill 2's narrative is phenomenal, and Silent Hill 4's narrative is very unique and well-paced, and mostly makes up for some of the dodgy gameplay decisions. Unfortunately, well-written game stories are not very common, and this is sadly true of horror games as well. I love Tormented Souls, but the story is a convoluted mess with tons of competing plot threads that don't fit together very well, and there are several supernatural elements that aren't explained at all. But for a good example of where bad writing absolutely killed an otherwise promising horror game, let's take a look at Lust from Beyond. This is a game that sells itself on the shock value that it's one of the few games rated AO and has graphic sex scenes. But the game starts off pretty promising, and it sets up a compelling, nuanced narrative that looks like it's going to explore some taboo but important aspects about the human condition in an intelligent and thoughtful way. For the first 3 chapters, the game slowly builds things up and raises the tension bit by bit. It seems like it's going to be a gradual and compelling descent into madness. Then, in Chapter 4, it throws all of that away and just suddenly has a bunch of nutty cultists burst in to try to kill you, and all subtlety vanishes from the narrative. It's disappointing that the game went over the top in terms of drama and shock value, but I was still intrigued enough by the story to keep going, and there were a lot of good moments. Unfortunately, the game went completely off the rails in the last 3 chapters, and culminated in an ending so terrible it put me off ever playing the game ever again. Without spoiling it, let's just say that the ending very strongly implies that anybody living with an addiction or mental health problem is incapable of managing their condition, is incapable of living a normal happy life, and the only way for them to be free is to die. And that is fucked up. I don't think that's the message the developers are trying to send, but that's effectively what the game ends up saying. This is one of many reasons why having good writing is something that should be prioritized more. I know game developers are not writers, which is why games with good stories are relatively rare. This is also why games with great gameplay often have mediocre or non-existent stories, and sometimes that's okay. But horror games are typically more narrative-driven than other genres, and having a well-written narrative can make all the difference. The first Silent Hill was a great horror game despite its messy story, not because of it, and Silent Hill 2 is still highly regarded primarily because of its superb narrative. So if you're planning a horror game, consider hiring an actual writer to do the story, or at least get them to look over your script so that they can help iron it out and ensure it makes sense. At the very least, you might want to get someone else to double check the story just to make sure you aren't accidentally sending out an incredibly problematic message. I know changes sometimes have to be made to the gameplay or level design, and that might necessitate tweaking the story, but it's better to have some sort of narrative plan and then change it, rather than not having any plan at all and just making it up as you go. And lesson 6, stop ripping off other games, especially Amnesia, Five Nights at Freddy's, and PT. The thing that made the first 4 Silent Hill games so compelling was how unique and different they all were. And one of the reasons why Silent Hill Homecoming sucks is that it's just a blatant and inferior ripoff of the original Silent Hill games. The best horror games, or even just the best games, bring their own unique ideas and style to the table. Even if a game is clearly inspired by another game, it should still have its own distinct identity. Tormented Souls very clearly took inspiration from both Silent Hill and Resident Evil, but it still manages to be its own thing as well. And it is a solid horror game, even if it is a little rough around the edges. But too many horror games don't take inspiration from other games, they just mindlessly copy. And when you mindlessly copy, you're just going to get an inferior imitation of other horror games, not a good horror game in its own right. So those are the 6 lessons indie horror games should take from the first 4 Silent Hill games, at least in my opinion. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and if you're interested in more content from me, be sure to check out my website in the description. Thank you for watching, and happy Halloween! Before I go, I'd like to touch on the rumors that Konami is working on new Silent Hill games. Personally, I am entirely indifferent to this news. These announcements indicate that Konami is doing the exact same thing it did after disbanding the original Team Silent, namely farming newer games out to a bunch of random studios. It's clear they've learned precisely fuck all from their mistakes and are just going to repeat them all over again. Anything good coming out of this process is going to be a freak accident, and we shouldn't get our hopes up. I mean, let's not forget how Konami botched the Silent Hill HD collection. They had a simple job, just remaster the older Silent Hill games for the newer consoles. That was it, nice and straightforward, and they still found a way to fuck it up. Pulling off a good remake of Silent Hill 2 is going to be significantly harder, and I just can't bring myself to get excited for it. I don't trust Bloober Team, and I especially don't trust Konami, and people should keep their expectations low. I'll admit that the teaser for Silent Hill F did pique my interest a little bit, as I did like the visuals, and apparently it's being written by the writer of Higurashi, which is an excellent horror story. But it's also being developed by Neobards Entertainment, a studio that hasn't actually made a game of their own yet, which sounds eerily familiar to some other Silent Hill projects that ended up not going so well. The only way a new Silent Hill game will work is if it uses the format established by the older games as an inspiration and jumping off point for its own original ideas, and doesn't just try to recreate the vibe of one of the older games. Unfortunately, every post-Team Sound game was clearly just trying to be Silent Hill 1 or 2 again, and it seems likely that this trend is going to continue with these newer projects, especially since one of them is literally just Silent Hill 2 again. Silent Hill F does seem like it will have a different setting and look from the older Silent Hill games, but we don't know anything about the story or gameplay yet, so we really can't draw any definitive conclusions. So basically, if you want an actually good Silent Hill game, your best bet is to look for brand new horror games that took inspiration from Silent Hill, rather than whatever game Konami happens to slap the Silent Hill name onto. Now, an announcement that I would get excited for would be if Konami revealed that they were going to re-release all of the previous Silent Hill games so that we can more readily access them. And I have heard rumors that they might do that soon, but at the time of writing, this has not happened. I'm a primarily PC gamer, and right now the only Silent Hill games I can purchase are Silent Hill Homecoming on Steam and Silent Hill 4 on GOG. If you want to play any of the other Silent Hill games, then you either need to buy an expensive secondhand copy, or you just have to pirate them. Personally, I'd recommend pirating the older Silent Hill games, since they deserve to be played and they aren't being sold anymore. Just stick all of the older Silent Hill games onto Steam and or GOG already, Konami, because otherwise people are just going to pirate them and be entirely morally justified in doing so. If you really want to pretend that you actually care about Silent Hill now, you could at least do the bare minimum courtesy of making the games available.